this episode, we're going to take vendor risk and turn it into a repeatable process, because the biggest mistake beginners make is treating each vendor as a one-off problem that must be solved from scratch. Modern organizations use many vendors, and those vendors can touch sensitive data, influence availability, or introduce security weaknesses through software, support access, or integrated connections. Vendor risk management, VRM, is the discipline of evaluating and managing those risks in a consistent way, so you can move quickly without accepting unknown exposure. The key is to build a system that starts before the contract is signed and continues throughout the relationship, because risk changes over time as vendors change their products, their controls, or their business circumstances. A scalable program has three major stages that reinforce each other. Intake, where you classify the relationship and set expectations. Due diligence, where you collect evidence and assess capability. And ongoing monitoring, where you watch for drift, changes, and signals of trouble. By the end, you should be able to describe how these stages work together and why skipping any one of them leads to predictable failures. Intake is the first stage because it determines how much effort is appropriate, and it prevents the common problem of treating low-risk vendors like high-risk vendors or high-risk vendors like routine purchases. Intake is the initial step where a vendor request is captured, basic information is gathered, and the relationship is categorized. The most important intake question is what the vendor will do, because that defines the risk boundary. Will the vendor store or process personal data, financial data, or internal business information? Will the vendor have administrative access to your environment? Will the vendor integrate with identity systems, data stores, or network paths? Will the vendor be a critical dependency for uptime? These questions are not meant to be interrogations. They are meant to establish the scope of risk and the type of controls that matter. Intake also captures who the internal owner is, meaning the person or team responsible for the vendor relationship, because ownership is required for accountability. When intake is done well, the rest of the process becomes smoother because everyone knows what is being evaluated and why. A key part of intake is classification, which is simply grouping vendors by risk level so the organization can apply consistent treatment. Classification often considers data sensitivity, access level, criticality to operations, and the potential impact of vendor failure. A vendor that never touches sensitive data and is easy to replace might require minimal review. A vendor that stores customer records or has privileged system access should require deeper review and stronger contractual protections. Beginners should understand that classification is not about labeling vendors as good or bad. It is about matching effort to impact. This is important because a program that tries to deeply evaluate every vendor will collapse under its own workload, and teams will start bypassing it. A scalable intake process keeps the door open for the business while ensuring that risky relationships receive proper attention. Classification also supports consistency, because two similar vendors should receive similar scrutiny, which builds fairness and predictability across the organization. After intake, due diligence is where you look for evidence that the vendor can meet your security expectations, and this is where many people either overdo it or underdo it. Due diligence means gathering information about the vendor's security controls, processes, and history in order to assess whether they are a reasonable risk. Beginners sometimes think due diligence is a checklist that ends with a pass or fail, but the more realistic view is that due diligence reduces uncertainty. The goal is to understand how the vendor protects data, manages access, monitors their systems, responds to incidents, and handles changes. Due diligence often includes reviewing independent assurance reports, security documentation, and answers to targeted questions. It can also include understanding where data will be stored, how it will be encrypted, and what subcontractors are involved. The key is that due diligence should focus on the risks that matter for the specific relationship, rather than collecting piles of irrelevant paperwork. When due diligence is tied to intake classification, it becomes more efficient and more meaningful. Evidence quality matters in due diligence because not all evidence provides the same level of confidence. A vendor's marketing page is not strong evidence because it is designed to reassure, not to prove. A detailed description of controls can be helpful, but it is still a claim unless it is supported by independent validation or observable practices. Independent assessments, security audit reports, and structured control attestations can provide stronger assurance because they are produced under defined criteria. Operational evidence, such as descriptions of incident response processes, vulnerability management practices, and access review routines, also matters because it shows whether the vendor can sustain security over time. Beginners should recognize that evidence is often imperfect, and sometimes you must make a risk decision with incomplete information. In those cases, you can use compensating controls, such as limiting the data shared, restricting access, or adding additional monitoring. The purpose of due diligence is not to eliminate all risk. It is to understand risk well enough to manage it deliberately. Due diligence should also examine the vendor relationship boundaries, because many risks come from assumptions about who does what. For example, a vendor might claim they encrypt data, but you need to understand whether encryption is at rest, in transit, and whether key custody is handled appropriately. A vendor might claim they log activity, but you need to know whether those logs are reviewed and how long they are retained. A vendor might claim they do regular patching, but you need to know how they handle emergency vulnerabilities and how quickly they act. Another boundary issue involves subcontractors, because a vendor might rely on other providers for hosting, support, or data processing. If subcontractors exist, you need to understand how the vendor manages them and whether your requirements flow down. For beginners, the key idea is that due diligence is about understanding the real path data and access will take, not just the primary vendor's brand. Risk follows the actual pathways, and those pathways can include multiple organizations. Once a vendor is approved and on board, ongoing monitoring becomes the stage that keeps the program honest, because risk is not static. Vendors can change their security posture over time due to growth, staff turnover, cost pressures, acquisitions, or changes in technology. Even a strong vendor can have incidents, and what matters is how they respond and what changes they make afterward. Ongoing monitoring means regularly checking for signals that the vendor relationship has changed in a way that affects your risk. This can include periodic updates of assurance evidence, review of significant changes to services, tracking of incidents or public disclosures, and confirmation that contractual obligations are still being met. Monitoring also includes verifying that internal usage of the vendor remains within the agreed scope, because internal teams might start using the vendor for new purposes without notifying anyone. That scope creep can turn a low-risk relationship into a high-risk one without a new review. Ongoing monitoring keeps the relationship aligned with the original risk decision. A beginner-friendly way to understand ongoing monitoring is to think of it as maintenance rather than re-evaluation from scratch. You are not repeating full due diligence constantly. You are checking key indicators that would tell you when a deeper review is needed. Those indicators might include changes in the vendor's hosting model, changes in where data is stored, new integration features, or changes to access methods. Indicators might also include missed service commitments, unusual support access requests, or inconsistent responses to security questions. If the vendor is critical, monitoring might be more frequent and more structured because the impact of failure is higher. For less critical vendors, monitoring might be lighter, such as an annual evidence refresh. The essential idea is that you need a cadence, because without a cadence, monitoring becomes reactive and you only look when something goes wrong. A cadence turns monitoring into a normal business rhythm. Ownership and communication are also essential across intake, due diligence, and monitoring, because vendor risk management fails when nobody knows who is responsible for what. The internal owner of the vendor relationship should understand what the vendor is used for, what data is shared, and what changes are being planned. Security teams often guide the process, but they cannot be the day-to-day operator for every vendor relationship in a large organization. This is why a scalable program distributes responsibility while maintaining consistent standards. Communication channels matter so that when a vendor announces a major change or an incident occurs, the right people hear about it quickly. It is also important that the business understands the purpose of the program, because if vendor risk management is seen as a blocker, teams will avoid it. When the program is framed as a way to enable safe adoption and reduce surprise, it becomes more accepted. For beginners, this is a reminder that security programs are socio-technical systems, not just technical checklists. Exceptions also play a role in vendor risk management, because sometimes the business needs a vendor quickly or a vendor cannot meet a requirement immediately. A scalable program includes a way to document those exceptions, understand the risk, and define compensating controls and timelines. For example, if a vendor cannot provide a certain type of evidence right away, you might limit the data shared until evidence is available. If a vendor cannot meet a security requirement, you might require additional monitoring or restrict integrations. The danger is allowing exceptions to become permanent without review, because that quietly expands risk. Ongoing monitoring can track exceptions, ensuring they have expiration dates and are revisited. This keeps the program realistic without letting it decay. Beginners should see exceptions not as failures, but as controlled decisions that must remain visible, because invisible exceptions are where programs lose integrity. It is also worth addressing the misconception that vendor risk management is only about avoiding bad vendors, because in practice it is about managing dependency risk even with good vendors. A reputable vendor can still have a breach, an outage, or a security regression. The question is whether your organization will be surprised and unprepared or informed and resilient. Vendor risk management supports resilience by ensuring you understand critical dependencies, have contractual expectations for notification and cooperation, and have monitoring that detects changes early. It also supports decision-making by helping leaders choose vendors based on risk, not just on price and features. Over time, a mature program can improve the market by rewarding vendors that invest in strong controls and transparency. Vendors respond to what customers demand, and consistent demand for evidence and good practices raises the floor. For beginners, the key idea is that vendor risk management is not fear-driven, it is discipline-driven. As we wrap up, remember that building vendor risk management is about creating a repeatable path from vendor request to safe ongoing use, using intake, due diligence, and ongoing monitoring as a coherent system. Intake captures the purpose, scope, data involved, access levels, and ownership so the relationship can be classified and handled appropriately. Due diligence gathers meaningful evidence to reduce uncertainty and to verify that the vendor can meet the security outcomes required for that risk level. Ongoing monitoring keeps the decision current by watching for changes, incidents, scope creep, and drift, and by refreshing evidence on a reasonable cadence. When these stages work together, the organization can adopt vendors quickly while still maintaining control over risk. When any stage is skipped, risk becomes guesswork, and guesswork eventually becomes an incident. This process is foundational for leaders because it turns vendor security from reactive panic into steady, scalable governance that supports both business speed and security outcomes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.